Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Tamara Chaplin. I'm a French historian, um, professor of modern European history at the U of I, University of Illinois, chercheuse associée at the Université de Paris Panthéon-Assas in Paris, and a former professional ballet dancer.
There's so much to unpack there, but your unpacking is your word right now because you're moving.
That is correct. That is correct. I'm speaking to you from the inside of an apartment that I am in the process of moving into. I have workers in the other room making a lot of noise, so hopefully you can't hear that. And I'm in the middle of kind of constructing a new life for myself. And in many ways, making possible a life that I think I've wanted since I was very, very small.
Well, that's exciting. That's exciting.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
unpacking, although difficult, is always better than packing.
Well, it's interesting, I mean, because one of the things that's been really fascinating about the past half of a year is that when you're packing, you're revisiting your life and making so many decisions about what comes, what stays, what's important,
Yeah.
what is valuable from the past, what are you willing to shed, all of those things. And it's been exciting, sometimes very challenging, sometimes very anxiety provoking process. Um, Ultimately, I'm not quite sure what this new um, international world is going to look like for me.
Because it is a
Um,
move from the cornfields and the subterranean libraries of Champaign, Illinois, to Paris.
yes, I mean, about 4 years ago, I started living in Chicago and I was commuting down to Urbana, but I have been in Urbana since 2002.
Mhm.
Um, Despite the fact that I swore I would never move to the Midwest, having grown up mostly on the coasts. I was trained as a dancer in Los Angeles and New York City. I worked as a professional in Montreal and Vancouver. And then eventually I came back down to Rutgers where I did my doctorate. But when the job came up at the U of I told my advisor, Bonnie Smith at Rutgers, that I would not apply for it because I did not want to go to the U of I. And my partner at the time was employed in New York. And she said, "You can get a new partner. This is a good job. Apply for the job." And they're not going to give it to you because you're not done with the dissertation, but they did. And I moved and I stayed. Um,
Well, can we,
but yeah.
they say in baseball, or in fact, softball commentary,
Mm.
back. Tell us about the dancing. And you were in LA, where I used to live. I still love it. I mean, I'm the only person in the world who loves LA, I think.
Okay.
Tell us about the dancing, because that's
Mm,
that's not only relevant in your career as a dancer and your formation as a professional, but also it's relevant in terms of some of the academic work you've done.
yeah, I think it's relevant for the most recent work that I've done. My mother was a dancer, choreographer, professor of dance. I started training with her when I was a child. We moved a great deal when I was young. Um, I trained with Pittsburgh Ballet Theater when I was very young, and then we moved to LA, and I met my mentor, Mia Slavenska, who danced with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. And I trained with her until I was 16. And the day that I turned 16, I moved to New York City. I moved out on my own when I was 15. Um, and then I moved to New York and continued to train. I was on scholarship with the Joffrey. I was working in television. I was in the TV series Fame, if you remember that, a million years ago, dancing on the
Oh
tables.
my
I
God,
didn't have a
celebrity.
speaking role, but I was like a background dancer. But I really wanted to be a ballet dancer,
Yeah.
and I auditioned for Le Grand Ballet Canadien in Montreal
Mhm.
and moved to Canada. Had a career with Le Grand Ballet until I was injured, and then I joined a modern company in Vancouver. Was injured again. Spent a year in acting school because I had been working in film and TV throughout that period, and I was a terrible actor. I have made some very bad movies. Um, and I thought, well, I'm not ready to give up the stage. I can't dance anymore. Maybe if I learn how to act, I could do something with this. But I was wrong. And after a year of intensive theater school in Vancouver, and doing a lot of other jobs, retail, managing a clothing store, cleaning people's houses, shit like that, a lot of restaurant work,
Right.
I decided to go back to school. So I started my undergrad when I was 30.
Wow, now that's bold. That is
Um,
because when you're
it
30,
didn't feel,
you
yeah,
don't
it
look
didn't
like
feel
it.
bold.
But 18-year-olds look at 30-year-olds suspiciously, don't they?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was, frankly, I felt stupid. I had left high school when I was 16. I couldn't drive a car. I'd never touched a computer. I didn't have any skills when I couldn't dance. And I like to read. I like to write. That came easily. And I ended up in a great books program that was modeled on the University of Chicago at, well, first I was at McGill in
Mhm.
psychology, and that didn't work. I had to do statistics. I'm very bad at math. And I ended up in Concordia's liberal arts college, which we used to call Plato to NATO because we started with the Bible and then we read like Plato and Aristotle and all the way forward until we ended with Foucault, who I fell in love with. And that led me to French history after 4 years.
And
Um,
I think becomes part of your eventual doctoral work.
exactly.
And that leads us on, in some ways, to your first book.
Yes.
If we can jump forward
hmm
a little bit.
Sure. Um, Really, I think in my final year as an undergraduate, I read Madness and Civilization and the History of Sexuality, and I was mesmerized. And I took a trip to France. And I was very curious because at the moment, it was that moment in the late 90s when everyone was mad about deconstruction and post-structuralism and Derrida. And these were like the big,
Mhm.
fancy celebrity figures. And I was curious about that status in the American Academy. And I went to France one summer and I went to the National Television Archive and I just punched Foucault into the database. And I came up with all these hits. And I was like, this person has been on television and who is watching this? And what does this all mean? And certainly coming from an North American context, we don't have that tradition of interest in intellectuals on TV. So I was fascinated and I was curious about its relationship to national identity. And that led to my dissertation and to my first book, Turning on the Mind, French Philosophers on Television.
So you spent a lot of time, this is my guess, in dark
Mhm.
rooms looking at probably somewhat shaky recordings of middle-aged white men with black backdrops smoking chitans.
Smoking cigarettes, yes.
Like I thought,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. And it was fabulous because at the time, I had to request these uh, television shows on videotape a year in advance because nothing was digitized. So I would give them the list, and then the next summer I would come to watch what I had requested through the database. And it was a fantastic language learning program because I was not fluent in French. And it was like being in a language lab all day long. And I
Wow.
would just be like, rewind,
And
listen,
but your
try and
tutor is
understand.
Roland Barthes.
It's Roland Barthes, it's Gaston Bachelard, it's Michel Foucault, it's, etc. They speak well for the most part. Alain Badiou, who was interviewing all of these people as a young man in the Radio Télévision Scolaire. So it was fascinating and a kind of a introduction by fire to French culture and intellectual life, but also to popular culture because I was watching TV. And that was really fascinating to me. That fusion was one of the things I was really interested in. What happens when we take high culture and we bring it to television?
So
is it possible?
What does happen?
What does happen? Well, I think, a couple of the things that fascinated me in that book. One was, on a more philosophical level, I was really curious about how you take abstract thought and make it visual. What does it mean to do that? And I was interested in the way that philosophy is a fundamentally oral discipline. So it is embodied. The Socratic method is an embodied method. So it lends itself actually remarkably well to that. At the same time, you're facing the constraints of television, and particularly the need to deliver fast. And television was in such a generative moment in terms of, it was quite different. Historically, it's progressed so much. The shows that you watch from the 1950s, they have a different rhythm. They have a different pacing. You have a slow close up on a face that will just stay there. No one would ever watch that anymore. We need this kind of radical editing that's going to flash something in front of us because we are so primed for that kind of stimulation. And so there's a different capacity actually to follow an idea in a way that I'm not sure that we still have the capacity for. Certainly my students don't seem to.
One expert also as both a dancer and a scholar in classical, inverted commas, dance and modern dance. What was it like focusing on these relatively static bodies? Because yes, of course, it's incarnate in form, the idea of philosophy, but they're moving their lips and their heads and they're smoking and their hands are gesturing. But it's not quite what you get at dance. Did you find you were using any of your knowledge of kinesiology, let's say, or human movement to understand them, or was it just a bit of a switch?
I think it's two things in terms of what my dance brings to my intellectual work.
Yeah.
I think one is separate from the question of watching the philosophers, is that for me, writing is an embodied practice. And the way that we compose a text is like a piece of choreography. And we think of it as it has to have a beginning, a middle, where's the crescendo, where am I speeding up, where am I slowing down? When I talk to my students, I really talk about the way that there's a pleasure in reading, there's a rhythm in reading, there's a movement in reading and writing. And I want to make that available to my reader, and I want to feel it when I'm doing my work, so that finding the right words for a sentence is about finding the right movement and the right rhythm. So there's that. In terms of the question of philosophers, the body doesn't have to displace itself in space in order to dance. And people do dance, even in very, even I just, the way that people gesture. Just yesterday, I was watching the 2017 documentary on Joan Didion.
Oh, yes, I know.
That Griffin Dunn did, right? And I mean, she's fascinating. She's this tiny, skinny, painfully thin woman who moves her hands, and it's like, and it's part of the way that she performs who she is, right? So all of that, and the way the camera works with it. I mean, when the camera, I think it was, who is it that they do this with? I'm trying to remember. I think it might be Monique Wittig. there's an interview on Lecture pour tous with Monique Wittig, a very early one. And the camera suddenly pulls to her legs. This is an interview, right? And it moves up her legs and her knees. I mean, there's a way of capturing visually what a person is, because we are embodied beings.
So the camera is dancing also.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yes, I think that's part of it, right? And it's the interaction too, because that's the other thing about philosophy on TV, is that it's this interaction. And I think if I could jump to the new book, that one of the things that really fascinated me when I started working on this history of lesbian life in 20th century France, initially I thought it was going to be a post-45 history. I thought of myself as a post-45 historian. And as I got into the material, it just took me back to where the book starts, which is in the cabarets. And I don't think I even realized at the beginning why that was so appealing to me. I stupidly didn't make the connection with my own life. Like why these performers were so fascinating to me, and why their presence also on television was a way of like bringing, because I talk a lot about these cabaret spaces, and the way in which they become publicized through the medium of television and bring these queer performances to a much broader public, which is a part. I mean, I've kind of jumped ahead, but it's a part of what the book talks about.
Very, very interesting. Now, I've had the great good fortune to have read your first book, but
I have the great good fortune that you've read it, because I don't think many people have, although I actually believe it's a fairly good book. So thank you.
It's a jolly good book, as they say we're in the United States. But I live in the global South, which means I don't have access to lots of scholarship. So I haven't read the new one. Could we go back to the first one? Not just because I read it, but just because I've got a question that's been bugging me.
Okay.
Pierre Bourdieu's book, Homo Academicus, the preface, as I recall, in its translation into English, which is for my English readers, in which he more or less says, and it's 30 odd years since I read it, all the people you think are important, Foucault, Barthes, Derrida, Baudrillard, are not in this book because they're not important. They are not relevant for the basic life of French academia. He's knocked over the tea. So,
oh no,
the Basque cat, he only speaks Euskera, which I don't speak, which, as some listeners may not know, is the only remaining Paleo-European language. He doesn't like it when I am using the computer. He can remove my reading glasses with either his teeth or his paws, and he can position himself behind the laptop and close the lid. Now,
he's talented.
Very. Unusually this time, he didn't do any of those things. He just knocked over the cup of tea and then ran away. So I'm just mopping up the cup of tea, Prof.
Okay.
Which is quite a task because, as you know, and listeners don't, I only made the cup of tea pretty recently. This is a bigger job than I thought. Now,
gosh.
I have, because of my surgery on Friday night, adult male diapers in the trash.
No.
In fact, don't need. This is, after all, French feminism, big on the abject. So
right, exactly.
So this is
appropriate.
Big time the abject. I can't believe I'm saying these things. But, anyway, the point that Bourdieu makes in this preface to my English readers is you're not going to read about all your famous French feminists or dudes. You're not going to read about, this sex which is not one, or geek, or, you're not going to read about Sissou, you're not going to read about Foucault, because they don't matter, because they don't teach anybody. What I'm interested in this book is what happens in a university in France. Now, they're both back. Darlings. Sorry about this, Prof. It's hard to know what will happen next. Anyhow, they're important to you in the United States because they've all been translated and they say things that interest you, but actually they're not part of real academic life in France. So ask you about that, about how significant these guys were, because on the one hand,
How what these guys were?
how significant
How
these
significant?
were. By guys, I mean, women as well as men.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They must have been for them to be on television.
I would say, one of the things that is absolutely central about the history that I wrote is that we're looking at public TV, and this is controlled by the state largely, right? This is didactic. This is along the lines of the BBC. This is educate, inform, entertain, with a big emphasis on the education and the information, right? And it's also so important to remember, both for my current work and for my previous work, that we're in a moment when, until 1972, we have two channels on television. So people are fascinated by this medium. And when they watch it, you turn on the television, you watch what is on. You do not have an opportunity to zap, right? And so you're much more of a captive audience than much, much more with a potential impact of material. And I think there's what's interesting to me in terms of the question of philosophy on French television is also the emphasis on philosophy within the French school system. The fact that students are taught philosophy in high school, which is something that does not exist. This idea that in order to be a upstanding part of French, to be a French citizen, one should be able to think. That is part of a mythology.
Yeah.
That is transmitted, and particularly in a moment of decolonization, in the aftermath of the Second World War. We're moving into Algeria. We're moving into, all of this crisis in French identity.
Right.
America and the USSR are rising to prominence on the world stage. What is France? It's food, it's couture in high fashion, and it's philosophy, it's existentialism. It's that is its cachet. And I think
the New York
there's
Times thinks it is, by the way. For my sins, I still read the New York Times every day. It's always got something about France. It's always about food.
Yeah,
always about food, and to a certain extent, those other things. But
right.
No, sorry.
So I think, so in terms of, do people actually read this stuff? How many people have actually read Lacan? I don't know, but they have him on their coffee table, right?
There's a story, wasn't there, that in the summer of 1966, 100,000 copies of Les Mots et les Choses, translated as The Order of Things by Foucault, were sold, and people were lying on the beach, again with their gitanes, their dark glasses and their tans, because they were light-skinned, and the book perhaps not always being thumbed through with absolute.
Right, but it was there.
But it was there. Okay, no, this is great. In terms of the business of French television, how then does queer cabaret get a slot when there are two channels and they're state controlled? And they're state controlled much more than was the case in Britain. I remember a fantastic Mad cartoon. Remember Mad magazine?
Sure.
Of the 60s, which, because younger listeners won't be familiar with this, but in those days it was routine when you watched TV that the thing would just break down, it would fuck up. Why, after the war, lots of GIs got jobs as television repairmen, they were guys. But it also would happen not just at the level of your set at home, it would happen at the level of the broadcast. And they would often get just a little sign that came up saying, "We're having troubles with transmission, please wait." And Mad magazine had a variety of these for different countries. And the one for France read, "General de Gaulle is not happy with the current programming. Please wait while we find something more to his taste."
There you go.
I may have elaborated a bit on the word.
Butchered that a little, but that's okay. Yeah.
So queer cabaret.
What's the connection? Well, I think maybe before I launch into that, just to introduce the book briefly. So the book, I actually have a copy of the book. Let's look at the lovely book.
It up.
There's the lovely book.
Lesbian.
Okay.
Ooh,
Becoming Lesbian.
It has a slightly Monique Wittig looking
character. Yes, no, this is actually Fred and her wife, Mickey. Okay. And the subtitle is A Queer History of Modern France. So the book emerged. I started working on it over 15 years ago. I had gotten into a relationship with a woman, and I was with my ex, a poet, for most of the time that I was working on the book.
Right.
I am friends with the French historian Julian Jackson, who has written a great deal of political histories, most recently of de Gaulle and Pétain and whatnot, but who'd also written an interesting history of Acadie, which is a homophile movement in France. And we were talking, and I had been thinking about writing something on the history of sexuality.
Right.
And one of the things I realized is that there was no history of lesbian life in France. We've got a lot on the interwar period. We've got a lot of people have talked about, especially the expats, Natalie Barney, Gertrude Stein, yada, da, da, da. Right. But there was no chronology of this. And I was actually interested in it in part, I think, because I became interested in the history of sexuality and gender. And in this notion, coming out of Foucault, probably, of, it's banal to say it, of identity as a historical construct. The question that I was interested in is, what does it mean to be or to become lesbian? How does a marginalized behavior come to be identified as a type of person? How does that person come to identify as a community? And how does that community make claims on the public sphere, particularly in a country that refuses to recognize the rights of groups and in which difference is allocated to the private sphere? So very different from the situation in the United States. And one of my key hypotheses was that the media played a very important role in that. That these claims on the public sphere in the 20th century are things that increasingly are happening through these mediums of communication. And as I started to work, it was a very interesting process, because I came to Paris in 2010 thinking I'm going to write a history of lesbians. And I got here and I couldn't find any lesbians, and I couldn't find any lesbian history. And I thought, how am I going to write this thing? There is actually a lesbian archive, the Archives Recherche Culture Lesbienne, which was open once a week for 2 hours. Very difficult to access. And eventually what happened is that I went to a conference on the history of French feminism. It was the 40th anniversary of French feminism in 2010. And I thought, if there are old feminists there, there will be old lesbians. I was right. I met some, and through them, I started to connect with other people and with other sources. And eventually, a big part of this book was made up of over 100 filmed interviews that I filmed for the book, which are now forming the basis for films, actually, that I'm working on with a collaborator, Olivia Pedroso. We're in the process of making a pitch to try and develop a documentary. So I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of filmed interview footage, much of it absolutely fascinating. And I started to amass a database of material. And all of this gradually brought me to thinking about, well, where did these women start to make contact with each other? And where did they start to identify and be identified as lesbian?
Yeah.
And ultimately, I discovered that one of the places that was happening was in the cabarets. and that there were many, many cabarets that nobody had talked about or worked on, that I discovered in Paris, although the book departs from Paris, but it starts in Paris. And that these spaces were publicly known as spaces where women who were interested in women would go. And there are well over 20 of them that appeared in the 1930s. Very few have been which have been worked on. So that was fascinating. And these women's roles as performers was also interesting to me. These spaces as economic spaces, these spaces as public spaces, as spaces that stamped a sort of right to the city. If we go back to Henri Lefebvre and that notion of the droit à la ville, right? Like, which counter a whole idea that the public sphere is a masculine space. And I was really interested in that. This idea that no, actually, these women were businesswomen, they were in the public sphere, they were present, they were visible. This is not an invisible history. In some ways, I mean, it's some of those same myths that I'm countering that George Chauncey wrote about in Gay New York, which was such a classic for American homosexual history. So I don't know, I've wandered a bit.
No, that's great. I mean, you're a very determined scholar, aren't you? The story of waiting a year to see the television interviews, the story of finding this archive that's only barely open, very imposing. Can I ask what it was like? You've mentioned US expats. As a US woman doing this, did you encounter difficulties or any open doors?
Yeah.
Somewhere else?
That's an interesting question. Both. I think there were people who did and who do resent my writing their story. And yet I also think I had access to people, a willingness to talk to me, to confide in me, because I was outside of their politics, their circles, their arguments. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that was important to me was not to write a political history, but really to try and get to not just the history of the white privileged expats, but of what women's lives were like. And part of that is captured in the subtitle of the book, A Queer History of Modern France, because part of the argument is that history is much queerer than we ever acknowledge, because we have many, many histories of women in France. Women in the French Revolution, women in World War II, women under Vichy, women in the labor, women in prostitution, women in this, that, and the other thing. And we always presume that they're straight. And what I was interested in showing was this far more diverse experience that actually exists around us all the time. It existed in the past, it exists now, it will exist in the future. And I wanted to queer the history of France by showing this specific history in that way. Yeah.
Sometimes there's a reaction against queer as a concept being inexorably, inviolably, invasively US-centric.
I mean, lots of people have written about that. Bruno Perrault, who's a friend of mine, has actually written a book about sort of queer France and what that means and that appropriation. I think for my purposes, the thing that's become more interesting in the course of writing is that asking, I mean, in the title here, Becoming Lesbian, there are questions about ontology and epistemology in terms of naming. How do we name our subjects? Who do we call a lesbian? How is queer different from lesbian? There are lesbians now who don't want to identify as queer. There are lesbians who are considered anti-trans. There are so many conflicts inside of the community. If there was one thing that I would redo about the book, it would probably have been to perhaps reconsider the trans question more profoundly. It's much more front and forward now. I look a lot at female masculinity in my book. But I'm really looking at women who people who were born female, who identify as female, and who love other people who were born female and who identify as female. Although I acknowledge that we don't always know how they identify. Sometimes it's how they were perceived, sometimes it's how they present, and sometimes it's the epistemic context in which they live, right? I think we can see that changing today. I look at my students, right? I just finished teaching a history of queer sexuality class. A high percentage of my students identify as gender fluid or they, them. That vocabulary was not available 50 years ago, even if that sense of being in the world was. So these things change. And as writers, as historians, that poses really specific challenges to us too. Like, because when you name something, you bring it into being. And so you have a lot of responsibility too. And it's also easy to be misunderstood. How do you keep flux in flow, like when you don't want to.
One of the things that historians and ethnographers both go through that's in common with some kinds of experiences of natural scientists is the so-called aha moment. You find an archival treasure, for example, or you meet someone who can explain things to you that you didn't understand. Did you have moments in writing the book or researching the book that surprised you, that took you aback, and that gave you a renewed drive?
I certainly had moments of, I met amazing people. One of the most incredible interviews that I did was with a woman named Liliane Robert, who was an accordionist in the cabaret of Suzy Solidor. Suzy Solidor opened a cabaret in 1933 and was a renowned cabaret artist through the 1960s. Very, very famous on television, radio, records, but also present in the theatrical scene and in the media. And Lillian had played the accordion in Solidor's last cabaret. I interviewed her when she was 94 in her retirement home, surrounded by stuffed animals and her little poodle. And she slept for much of the day when I was there taking photographs of images and whatnot. But at the end of the day, before I left, I woke her and I said, Lillian, I have to go. I have to get on my train. I have to go home. And she said, oh, you can't leave. And I said, why not? She said, because I haven't played for you. So she gets up, and she's this tiny little woman, and she goes over to the corner and she unpacks her accordion, which is very heavy, and she puts it on, and she needs my help to do that. And she gets pissed at me because I'm not helping her properly. And I had already dismantled my camera, and I grab my camera and she starts to play and sing. And it was the most astounding performance. And I think it was a song that she said had never been recorded, but actually Edith Piaf had recorded the song. And it's called Fallait-il. And it's a song that in her telling was about a woman who was in love with another woman who leaves her. But the reality is that there's no gender in the story. It's just the way she tells the story. And it's that moment of imagination and imaginative projection and her complete conviction that this is what the song was about that was really revelatory to me about how we shape memory, how we shape history, how we shape narrative. That was amazing. I had so many incredible, incredible interactions with the people who were willing to talk to me. And it's a complicated thing, oral history too. So,
had you done much of it before?
I did oral interviews for my first book. I interviewed some really remarkable. I interviewed, for example, a man named Pierre Dumayet, who was one of the most important television interviewers from the 1950s through the 1980s. And I interviewed him when he was in his 80s. And he actually was the first man to interview Michel Foucault on TV.
Okay.
So, yes, I had done some interviewing, but I wasn't trained in it. So I was kind of trying to figure this out on the spot. And then once I decided that I was filming too, it was just kind of a bit of a chaos thing because I had the camera, I was the interviewer, I was the light person. I was trying to handle all of that. And it's a lot, as you would know from doing your podcast thing that you're doing. And speaking in French, which has improved over time, but yeah, and trying to maintain a connection with people, to get them to talk to you about things that sometimes are very difficult, or hidden, or make them vulnerable, which is a whole other thing that now in the current climate has concerned me.
Can you talk a bit about that in the French context or the US one?
I think the US context makes us aware that we just can't take our freedoms for granted. I mean, things are rolling back so dramatically right now. At the beginning of the semester, when I started teaching my undergraduate course in queer sexualities, I said to them, the very first thing that I'm going to say in this class is that sexuality and gender are historical constructs. And the President of the United States, in his second inaugural address, declared that there are only two genders, male and female. So that is a complete disconnect. And the things that I'm saying here could get me fired in certain states in the United States, and have done, colleagues of mine. I was just at a conference in Ireland, Lesbian Lives conference in Cork, Ireland, a couple of weeks ago. And I was presenting with the Lauren Gutterman, who was the chair of American Studies, and Lisa Moore, who was the chair of Gender and Women's Studies. Neither of those departments exist now. It's astonishing. I never thought I would see this happen in our country. And knowing that one makes oneself vulnerable in a performative space like the classroom is frightening. And we don't know what's happening in France, the next presidential elections, the Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, whatever. The far right is definitely present, increasingly powerful, trying to court the homosexual vote. But it's when you ask people to reveal themselves to you, like, you make them very vulnerable. No?
Oh, absolutely. I think back to my own Whiggish tendencies in the sense of an unfurling story of history per Lord Acton. I remember that when Jimmy Carter won in 1976 and Bill Clinton won in 1992, I thought, well, that's it. Those bastards are for it forever. These people are just liberal, but at least they don't hate everybody around them. Everything's going to get better. And even the revanchist Republican Christianity of the 90s and 2000s, that seemed something that could be sustained, at least within universities and on the part of social movements and the big foundations, which, by the way, I'm sure are the next liberal targets of the Orange Comb-Over and its maladministration. How wrong I was. I was wrong in 1976. I was wrong in 1992. I've been wrong ever since. These things are fragile toeholds. And there are people who use hatred to advance. There always have been across history, of course. You know this better than do I. But the other thing is there is also a cynical, smart manipulation. So I think of, for example, Le Pen in France, in which she courts young people by saying, no taxes till you turn 30. Or she says, be environmental, vote for us. We're going to stop people from slaughtering animals.
Well, I mean, she also says, and one of the things that I talk about in the last chapter of my book, because I look at the question of race, because the book is largely a history of white women. Those are the sources that I have. There are some interesting diversions from that, but I really, when we start to have a visible presence of women of color, this doesn't happen until the 90s, really.
Right.
But one of the things that I talk about is when you have the far right on the rise courting the gay and lesbian vote by basically targeting Muslim people of color for being homophobic and saying, join us, be French. This divisiveness, it's just, it's horrific, and it works. For some people, it works, actually, right? Because it's a way of maintaining privilege. It's a way of maintaining status, power. And because people are complicated. Yes, people are complicated.
And they can be X or Y or Z on Tuesday and Friday and not the rest of the week. Sorts of things. Not just sex and sexuality, but reading preferences, sporting preferences, you name it.
I mean, Eve Kozovsky-Sedgwick in The Epistemology of the Closet, right? In the introduction axiomatic to Epistemology of the Closet, one of the things that she says is people are different, right? We know that. Then the question becomes, why and how do we make difference matter? Right? This is what I say to my students when I'm teaching the history of modern Europe in the world, the big Gen Ed lecture class that I teach, and I talk about slavery and racism, and I talk about race as a social construct, and I say to them, well, race is a social construct. And they say, well, what does that mean? And I'm like, I'm not telling you that there aren't people who have different colored skins, right? I'm telling you that what it means is socially constructed, and why one means more than, et cetera, right? It's the same thing. That's what's fascinating. Why and how does difference matter at different times? Who gets to be powerful? Who gets to name? Now, I'm a Jew. I'm not a practicing Jew. Wouldn't have made a damn bit of difference in the 1930s whether I thought of myself as a Jew or not, right? So, and all of those things, those questions of identity are really fascinating to me and important.
We've just had the anniversary of the D-Day landings, and horrendous things from the guy who has the same pomade as Gavin Newsom. They both need a trip to the hairdresser, and I'm prepared to pay for half. But quite apart from that, the problem for me is that when I hear the word Europe, I think of the cauldron of grotesque killing, subterfuge, and sequestration. That's the great European legacy for me. Where do the world wars start? Oh, I don't know. Gee, Virginia, Cuba? I don't think so. Where do these terrible bloodlettings occur over centuries? Right? But for people like Hegseth and Vance, they're occurring now. And they're occurring now really because Africans, as broadly defined, are living in France and Spain and Britain. That's really what this means, as far as I can tell. Right? So there's this twisted version, going back to your, Plato to NATO studies, which I'm all in favor of, by the way. I think one should learn from NATO. And for me, of course, NATO still means the North Atlantic Theatre Owners Association, which has changed its name. It's worth knowing all of that. But they don't understand the history that goes with it. And their account of the present is based fundamentally in a racist vindication of slavery in the Americas. This is what I'm seeing anyway. And it really horrifies me. I've got a friend at one of the U of I's, I won't say which one, but it's not Illinois, who teaches the history of slavery, and he is required statutorily to give both sides of a slavery debate. Now, of course, there are many aspects to debates about slavery, but you know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
He's supposed to stand up in front of black students and talk about all the great benefits that came to them and their families.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was like the big debate that happened here. I can't remember when it was, 2005 maybe, about the teaching of colonialism, the benefits of colonialism in French history, right? I mean, it's, yeah. But I think the thing that's, I think it's so overwhelming to me, the state of the world today. Um, Sometimes I feel like I live in a world that's not real, or I think I live in a world, but it's not really the world I'm living in. I talk to, I mean, the way that technology controls so much of what comes into, there's so many things,
Yeah.
but I'm overwhelmed and anxious about the political state of the world, about the threats to human rights, about the threats to the planet, which I think everybody is ignoring, about the way that we've just suddenly embraced AI. Even I use it, right? I mean, we all do, but without really thinking about what the larger impact is economically, socially, environmentally, et cetera, et cetera. We're just on this like headlong rush towards these things with no consciousness. And a lot of it makes me think the thing that I fear, I suppose, is a growing incapacity to think, to reason, to learn, to focus, that I see in my classrooms. That's a function of our exposure to the kinds of technology that we have now, and our addictions to them. And it makes me think of, I guess, two different things. One is I interviewed a television producer named Yves Jégu, brilliant man who had produced some really amazing public television for French television in the 1970s and 80s. And he said to me, I like this and I don't like that without knowing the reason why is the root of all evil. And I thought, that's brilliant. And I often talk to my students about that when we have an opinion, it has to be informed or we are completely vulnerable. And I think the other thing is there's a, think what you may of Václav Havel, the first president of the Czech Republic, but he has that beautiful essay on the politics of hope. And he's being interviewed because, he's Polish, a Czech dissident and imprisoned and whatnot. And he was asked at some point, did you really believe that communism would end? What kept you going during that period when everything looked so black? And he talks in this essay, if I remember it correctly, it's a long time since I've read it, about the fact that you don't do something because you believe that it will make a change. You do it because not doing so diminishes your humanity. And that's kind of as good as a manifesto for living, I think, as we can get,
Can I just go back, though, to the I like, I don't like, because this, of course, reminds me of Roland Barthes' famous list, J'aime, je n'aime pas. He has these things he likes, he doesn't like. I guess my defense of that and my defense of binarism is that binaries are good to think with.
Oh, yes, they are.
And pull apart, because getting back again to Derrida, they are always logocentrically interdependent despite their attempts at opposition. So I think having a list of I like this, I don't like that is fine, as long as we get to the point that you insist on, which is that we interrogate in ourselves why and what that signifies. So when I think of the multiple irritations that I experience every day, many of which are sort of fallen, shabby, middle-class irritations, I can control myself. I can go beyond primary process and work out why this is niggling away at me when really it doesn't matter. But there's something
Yeah.
there often at the root of these things that can be about one's personal history, but also very much about privilege and the threats to privilege. Being able to get at that is terrifically important. Prof, I've got one more question for you, if I may. And once you've
Sure.
answered, I want to give you the opportunity to add anything else you wish. It could be something entirely new, like a wedding, something borrowed, something blue, or it could be terrain we've already traversed where you want to say a little bit more. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things together?
Sure. Yeah.
So my question is boring and annoying when you get this amazing book come out and you're moving countries, which is what's on the docket next? What's the next research project? Do you know? Do you need to have a big rest because of all the changes in your life that are going on? What's the scoop?
Mm. I think I hope very much to see a French translation of this book. I would like to give it back to the people that it was written about.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I would like to also pay homage to the people who permitted me to interview them by actually making some of those interviews available through the films that I have, because I also think that, I mean, it's trite to say, but you can't be what you can't see. And seeing the history of those who have gone before is really, really important, especially now. Also because it humanizes us. So there's that. But the third thing is, I want to be more in my future than do. I want to focus a bit more on just looking out this window at this gorgeous Parisian skyline and the sun. I want to breathe.
Well, you've earned it. You've earned it. Fame, French TV, lesbian history, moving countries and cities many times. You've earned it, Prof.
I don't know that it's funny because people say sometimes, oh, well, you deserve this. And I think, oh my God, I am so fucking blessed, the life that I live. I don't deserve it anymore. I mean, there are so many people who work so much harder than I do and get so much less recompense. But we have one life.
Well, and they deserve it too. Guess what?
And they deserve it too. Maybe it's that. They deserve it too. But also, like, let's pay attention. We never know when it's going to be gone. I always say to my students, at the beginning of the semester, I say to them, I want to thank you because you're giving me the most precious thing that you have, and that is your time. None of us know how much of it we will have. So thank you for spending it with me. And thank you, actually, Toby, for spending this time with me today.
Well, it's been a great pleasure and a privilege, Prof. I think you've added what you wanted to add. Yeah?
What? Sorry, I've got a call coming in now. It's my brother.
So
yeah, I think I did.
it was
Yeah.
really great catching up after decades. And your work is brilliant, and I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.